welcome to the Passenger Seat Podcast, a podcast designed to fill your passenger seat with chat about classic cars, all recorded from my 1968 Morris Minor Peggy. I'm Becca, and today I'm on my way home from work. But today I'm going to tell you about something far more exciting than work, and that's something to do with holidays and where we went on our holiday last year. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about one of my favourite stops on the trip we made to the Netherlands in the summer of 2023. Now, when I was researching places to go, places to visit during our trip in the Netherlands, I, like many of you probably do, typed in car museums in so-and-so or car places to visit in so-and-so. And basically the first museum that came up on Google was the Louwman Museum. I looked through it and a few other options and decided that it was definitely a place worth making a stop to on our holiday, and given that we were trying to keep car related things to a minimum, it ended up being our only directly car related thing that we did, other than obviously touring around the country in Peggy. But it was an absolutely fantastic stop. We had an absolutely brilliant time. I have become fully obsessed with this museum. I absolutely love it, and I really wanted to share some more details with you, so that if you are thinking of going abroad and going to the Netherlands, or even passing through the Netherlands, you might consider making a stop to the museum. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it's like, what the sort of things you can expect to find there, and some of my favourite stuff. In 1934, Peter Louwman, who was a Dodge dealer in the Netherlands, decided to keep a hold of a 1914 Dodge car to display within the dealership, and also kind of hold on to it for future generations to look at how much automobiles had changed. Obviously, the car was 20 years old then, and it wasn't really something that a lot of people were thinking about. And from there, it really started to blossom out in terms of having more collections being donated to them, more cars being offered up for the family to look after. The museum and all of the cars involved in the collection is still within the Louwman family, as Peter Louwman's son followed in his father's footsteps with his huge interest in automobiles and everything that kind of surrounds them, and also in his footsteps in terms of becoming an importer himself. So the Louwman family are big Toyota and Suzuki importers into the Netherlands to this day. But the museum is really, it feels very much like a passion project for their love of cars rather than anything else. It really started up in earnest in the 1960s, and for a while it was known as the National Automobile Museum for the Netherlands, and it has had quite a few different locations as well. However, it moved to its current location and current absolutely outstanding, architecturally interesting building in 2010. And so it's located near The Hague, and that's why we actually decided to include it in our little trip, because we were moving from a hotel near Amsterdam up to The Hague on the Friday, and it was literally on our route through, no real diversion, so it seemed like a good place to stop, spend the day before our second hotel was ready for us. And as I'll get on to, you definitely need a whole day for it. You will be able to spend a whole lot of time here and enjoy every second of it. If you're wondering kind of what the thought process is behind the sorts of cars that you'll find in there, Evert, who is Peter Louwman's son and the current custodian of the Louwman Museum, states that it was never intended as an all-encompassing, every single make, model of everything sort of car museum, but instead designed to really give you a strong feeling of the story and everything that really rose up around automobiles, around motoring, around everything like that. And so it's never intended to have one of everything, but to really just give you a sense of what was out there, what the world kind of looked like around those automobiles, and also the fascination that was really growing with them. And I think it really achieves that. You do feel like for a vast majority of the museum that you are moving through a history with these cars and experiencing a little bit of kind of what happens around them and how they are so intrinsically linked with the time period that they are part of. And it's fantastic to see a museum do a brilliant job of displaying cars in that way. So let's kind of move on to what you can expect if you're going to the Louwman and visiting. So the first things first are, if you are arriving in a classic car, so something that is over 40 years old, you get a little bit of special treatment, as you should if you've bought your car on this magnificent pilgrimage. So you get to park directly outside the front of the museum, and it's free parking as opposed to paid for like if you were in a modern. And so you get to drive up the footpath really to the front of this beautiful museum and get pride of place in front of it. It's some fantastic photo opportunities there, and whilst we were there, Peggy was joined by an absolutely gorgeous traction Avant and also an MGB GT, which isn't a lot, but we did go on a Friday, and when we spoke to a guide later on, they did say that actually it does get taken up quite a lot by car clubs on weekends, and so it really adds to the experience of being able to see a few extra cars outside. And obviously I was quite surprised to see two British classics, including Peggy, outside the museum on the day that we went, and the other being a French classic. Once you've got your ticket, you're directed into the main hall, and having seen the building from the outside, it is really big, really purpose-built, purposefully designed for the purpose of displaying these cars. And you can see the thought that went into it as you enter the Great Hall. But you've got to try and not get too distracted, because the beautiful cathedral-like built room that you're in is not actually the start of the tour. You start the tour upstairs on like the second or third floor up, and so you go through this hall to the back of it and go up in a lift, and you come out of this lift and you're faced with a beautiful stained glass of an automobile that I think is being fixed by someone. There was a couple of stained glasses, but again it adds to this really cathedral-like feeling to the building, where you are in a place of great respect for automotive, for motoring, and that there's been a lot of thought go into making this place feel really special, and like a pilgrimage, like I said, for you to go to and experience all of these fantastic cars. Following on from that, you move into the first of the display halls, and it actually starts with some pre-motoring transportation that really sets the scene in terms of, okay, this is what people were using to really get about. So there's some historic horse-drawn carriages. There's some of those carriages that you see that were carried by servants and slaves, where rich people didn't want to get their kind of feet on the mucky streets at the time. And it does make you kind of think, wow, this is kind of what came before, what a big step those first automobiles would have been. You go through like this little replica of a blacksmith's and all the people that would have worked on coach building and stuff like that for the horses, and later on you'll come to a replica of an early garage, and it's fascinating to kind of see that whilst the transportation in a very short period of time moved on massively, if you put those two exhibits next to each other, you wouldn't see a huge amount of difference. And I think that really speaks a lot to kind of how the technology almost moved on faster than we were prepared for. You then go through to, and this bit really stuck with me, there's like a little screen that shows a video, and it's a load of clips of historic motoring, historic ads, historic personal family videos and stuff like that of various different people using their cars throughout the years. And it's all set to She by Elvis Costello, so that's playing in the background. And it was a weirdly very emotional video. Again, might be to do with the surroundings, might be to do with everything else, but you very much become quite absorbed in the video, and you're paying a lot of attention to it, and the kind of message of it being that these are more than cars to so many people. These are part of family life, part of living, part of how we live our lives. And yeah, it was really quite oddly beautiful, and there was, other than the music, there wasn't any words or anything, and so it transcended language barriers that could have been there, because there was quite a lot of people coming from lots of different European countries, and also coming from lots of places abroad. So we had some Americans, I think, that were going around at about the same sort of time as us, and obviously ourselves in English. So I think there was a group of us stood there that all felt the same sort of thing, and then you turned round and saw one of the oldest surviving early forms of automobile. So it really transports you back to the beginning, and then from there you start working through these glass fronted, blacked out rooms that you kind of stand and look into, that have very early forms of automotive history and automobiles, and they're not restored. They show every part of their history all over them, and you really see it. And in some cases it's quite spooky, because so many of them are black and they've got little parts of fabric and stuff hanging off of them where it's come loose, and they're all so beautifully lit as well that it feels a little bit spooky and a little bit eerie, but it's so moving as well, and you can spend so long just looking at little details and things like that. And they've also like put different things together that are from a similar year, so you can see different things that were being experimented on, or they've put a couple of vehicles together that are all from the same small company that was trying out some unusual things as well. And it massively makes you think about kind of that progress that was being made, those thought processes that were going on, and everything alongside that would led us to what we now see as a pretty straightforward expectation of a vehicle. You see some really bizarre and interesting, like, people facing each other, people sat kind of opposite each other whilst where the engine's in a completely different place. And then also cars that genuinely look like horseless carriages, and it does make me think that there's some people that say that EVs at the moment only look like what we know as cars because it's what we're used to and what we've experienced for years. And those early horseless carriages are very much an example of that. And then when we've come to understand what works better for that mode of transport when it's got an engine in it, we've adapted it and changed it. And looking at those vehicles really made me think about that. So it's truly a fascinating experience. All of the signs are in both Dutch and in English, so there's lots of stuff for you to be able to take in and experience and learn so much about. There were so many manufacturers that I'd hardly ever heard of or never even seen a real life in front of me example of before, which was really special. And you work your way kind of through that and see the progress. And then when cars really start to look like cars, is marked by, in this case, Mercedes-Benz, well, by Benz even, and there's a little bit about Bertha Benz, and it's all these cars are displayed on the early examples of road that existed in The Hague that have been transported to the museum to display the cars on. So you really start to see kind of how the world was changing around the introduction of these new vehicles. And yeah, it then kind of goes on from there into a bit of a timeline, and you work your way through that. It includes from there some little sections that are specifically about different types of cars. So there's a section on like steam and early electric cars, and there's this really cute like car slash train looking thing that is an early version of like a steam trial with vehicles, and it sections stuff off like that as well later on. So once you've worked through some fantastic examples of kind of these are what was really happening in like the 1920s, in the 1930s, all the way through, you then go into, okay, well this is some interesting examples of steam and electric cars. This is some interesting examples of cars that were really key in America, and these were some examples of some cars that played important roles in certain races that played a big role in changing the way the world saw motor racing. And each big race that happens has a little section within the museum where you're able to really take in some cars that actually raced at each of them. Now, when I was doing my research about going and visiting the Louwman, I discovered that it's actually home to Genevieve and her rival from the film, which is a Spiker double phaeton. And I was so excited because it's my dad's favourite film, and I thought, oh great, I'm going to be able to see Genevieve and see the Spiker and send loads of pictures and stuff like that. And it is actually right at the beginning of the kind of, as the timeline broadens out, part of the museum is a lovely little display where Genevieve and the double phaeton are supposed to be, and they weren't there. And there was two little signs that said that they were away for some preparation work and some restoration work, and I was absolutely gutted. And then turns out that they were kind of being prepared for transportation over to the UK, where they've spent some time at Bewley and are then going to be used in the London to Brighton for 2023, because it's the 70th anniversary of the movie. So that's where they were, and I just can't believe that I went all the way over there, so excited to see them, and they're now over in the same country as me the entire time. So but if that's something that you're really interested in, then they are usually there, and they do sometimes take them out for drives around the grounds. And there is a big Spiker exhibition as well. They have examples of quite a few different Spiker cars, which I'd never really seen before, or at least never paid much attention to, and it was fascinating to kind of see their cars that truly have Dutch heritage in them being produced in the Netherlands. So that's somewhat of an overview rundown of what's there, but I really wanted to spend a little bit of time highlighting a few of my favourite parts and some bits that really stood out to me, so that I could tell you a few of the things that I learned, a few of the stories. That means that you've still got lots of things to see and learn when you go over, but also some stuff to look forward to. Firstly, a bit of an oddball. I have never really been an artsy person. I did art GCSE and I went to a few art exhibits and stuff, but it wasn't until I discovered kind of automotive art that I found something that really interested me. And this museum has a huge and brilliant section of automotive art, and I think I could have spent so much time here if we had it. It starts off primarily with examples of art that are used for advertising in period, and these are big full-size either originals or like the original posters that would have been out on the street, on the side of buildings, etc. in period, in dealerships. And a lot of them are kind of like, when you get up close to them, they are huge, and you can really see the amount of detail and effort that went into essentially advertising and trying to get people to get on board with these new fandangled vehicles that we're all about. And they truly are magnificent pieces of art that somebody spent a huge amount of time and investment into to be able to kind of get a vehicle into the hands of the public and to sell the lifestyle that came along with it as well. So your saloon cars would be sold with a certain style of lifestyle, and then the sports cars of the period would be advertised in a completely different way with different art styling and things. And it was just fascinating to walk around and just really take that in, and it really made me think about how automotive advertising has changed, and what a huge amount of artistic and creative work went into it originally, and how that's changed with like the introduction of photography. And that leads quite nicely into my second favourite part of this art exhibition, and that was the discovery of Frederick Gordon Crosby. I found myself walking around this section and falling in love with a piece of art and going, wow, that's so detailed and such an interesting way of displaying like this part of a race, or this breakdown, or whatever it might be. And then I'd look at who had done it, and it would be F. Gordon Crosby, and I was like, oh, okay. And then I'd look at something else and it'd be like a caricature or a cartoon, and I think, wow, that's such a cool example of like people interacting comedically with these new and strange vehicles that were taking over. And again, it was F. Gordon Crosby, and I got to the point where I was like, oh my gosh, everything that I love in here was painted by him, and I'd never heard of him. And I ended up, before we'd even got back to the hotel, I'd managed to get on order this book that was released in, I think, like 1973, about his work, about where he'd come from. And I learnt that basically he was a on the books commissioned artist for Autocar. So much of his work was essentially, again, thinking about that fact that automotive photography wasn't as accessible, wasn't as available, and so they were using artists to fill the pages of these beautiful magazines, and he was one of them. And his absolutely gorgeous works of art to do with races and stuff that was going on was often the only way that some people were going to ever see what was going on at Le Mans or on the Monte Carlo, and it was absolutely the gorgeous works. And also when you find out that he, during the war, became a war artist, so was showing kind of planes and on battlegrounds and all of that, you can see how the automotive art and things fed into that, because of how dangerous and scary and on edge a lot of early automotive racing was. There's really more crossover between the two in terms of it being quite a scary thing to have to reproduce, but also a really interesting and historically necessary thing to see produced in art. And so I absolutely loved it, and I love the book that I've got now of his work. It's absolutely stunning, and I actually was able to help somebody out on one of the forums that I'm on Facebook for cars, because they were like, I've got this photo that I found in a charity shop, and I can't work out what this car is and where it is, and I recognised it immediately as a Gordon Crosby work. And you might know about him, but I had never heard about him, and I think his work is so cool, and so I really wanted to highlight some of that on this, because I discovered it through the Louwman, and I'd probably had never heard of him if it wasn't for that. And I was frankly hugely disappointed that there was no prints or anything in the gift shop of his work, because I would have loved to. They've got most of his original collection in the Louwman, so I would have loved to have been able to purchase a print or something of one of his pieces of work. Moving on to vehicles that really interested me. This one really caught both me and Jamie's imagination, and it's a car called the Golden Zebra. It is a Daimler show car that was used in the motor shows of the 1950s, and was actually the last one designed under the Docker's ownership of Daimler. And it is a all white, ivory coloured Daimler XK400, I think is the name of the chassis number, and it's got gold plated bright work all over the outside. It originally had a dash that was made out of ivory, but that's since been replaced by a kind of replica ivory. And then the seats are all zebra hide. There's a golden zebra as the bonnet mascot, and it's truly a piece of huge extravagance. You wouldn't expect to see anything like that nowadays, and to think that that was produced, I think, in 1955 was just hugely, like, so close to when people were still on rationing and things like that. Just so hugely extravagant, and unfortunately the extravagance was not something that worked in the car or the Docker's favour, and they'd been creating hugely extravagant cars for the motor shows for Daimler for a great many years, and unfortunately not long after that the extravagance was starting to wear on the executives and stuff at BSA who owned Daimler at the time. And not long after the Golden Zebra had been exhibited, Lord Docker was removed from his position, which meant Lady Docker was no longer involved in the creation of these exhibition extravagant vehicles, and things really went downhill from there. Two of the Daimler exhibition cars were asked to go to the wedding of the Prince of Monaco and Grace Kelly, and the Dockers themselves were invited, but when they were told that they couldn't turn up in one of the Daimler vehicles themselves and they had to go in the transport with all of the other guests, they basically said that they weren't going to go. They went to a casino, and Lady Docker ran her mouth off in the casino about the Prince Rainier, and so she was basically banned and thrown out of Monaco as a result. So they had a rapid decline from there, and I think by the mid-60s they were tax exiles in the middle of the Channel Islands, living in Jersey. And to think that just 10 years before they'd been creating cars as extravagant as the Golden Zebra to exhibit wealth and the status of Daimler, only to be massively kind of shunned. And that was all, a lot of that information was there beside the car, and to kind of take that in alongside the information and the beauty and extravagance of the car that was before us was quite a really interesting and something that really stuck with us as museum goers. Something else that I hadn't really realised before I visited there was that in their racing section they had one of the cars that was in the 1903 Gordon Bennett Cup, and this is actually a race that Frederick Crosby had painted, and one of his paintings showed the cars that were there, and I learned where British Racing Green came from. Essentially, kind of like Eurovision, the Gordon Bennett Cup worked that if you won, you then hosted it, but racing on public roads was still illegal in the UK, and thus they had to ask Ireland if they would host it for us. And as a little thank you to them for hosting it for us, they painted all of the British cars that were taking part in the Gordon Bennett Cup that year in an Irish green to thank the Irish hosts. And that then became British Racing Green, which I thought was fascinating and really interesting. Also, being the Netherlands National Automobile Museum for some period of time, there's quite a large display of Tulip Rally memorabilia, and I'd never really thought of or considered the fact that tulip maps came from the tulip rallies when they started in the 1950s, and having done so many things to do with tulip maps in the past, it was fantastic to see some very early forms of it in those display cabinets. Now, I couldn't possibly tell you everything in the museum, like I said. Those were just a few of my unusual little highlights that I thought stood out to me. I'm sure walking around you'd spot loads of different stuff all for yourself. But one last thing that I would love to highlight is the cafe, because it's truly a very special experience. We were getting a little bit peckish, so we followed the signs to the cafe that cut us out of where we were walking around by kind of the 3/4 of the way through, and it then led us into what looked like a kind of replica street, much like the sort of thing that you'd see at like Beamish and stuff like that, but it was all indoors. It had replica shops and awesome memorabilia displays and a replica of the original dealership that Louwman's father Peter had sold his Dodges from and inspired the start of it. And this was the cafe. You sat and you sat on the street of this early 1930s style street, and had the most beautiful street lighting, and you felt like you were sat there kind of on an evening in a beautiful summer's day out on the street outside this little cafe, enjoying some really delicious food. But it took us a while to get to that point, because we walked in and we were like, oh my gosh, this is gorgeous. And even Jamie, who was usually very food motivated, was distracted by like the amount of details and intricacies that were in this cafe. And I was like, wait, we've really got to order some food before it gets too busy in here, and then we'll kind of carry on marvelling about everything that's around us. And we had some really tasty food and spent ages looking around it, and then obviously we went back into the rest of the museum. Then the way that you walk out towards the end of your walk round, you come back out through it, and then after we've been around the gift shop and stuff, I wanted to pop to the loo and before we headed off to our hotel, and that meant that I got to walk back through the restaurant and cafe another 2 times, and I was so thrilled by the fact that I got to walk in and out, and just the street was just so beautiful, and it was very encompassing, and just felt like so much effort had gone into a cafe. It was brilliant. I'd seen pictures of the street on like Google Pictures and stuff for the museum, but had no idea that that was where you sat for having a little break, cup of tea, cafe stop, and it was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So, to conclude, if you are a car enthusiast looking for a museum to stop off at in the Netherlands, I cannot highly enough recommend the Louwman. It was a fantastic experience. We loved it, and I reckon you could spend hours and hours and hours there. We got there, I think, at around 10:30, pretty early, and we weren't leaving until gone 3 o'clock. And that was when we should really start getting a move on and stop marvelling over every single thing. It truly feels like an absolutely magnificent cathedral to automotive and to motoring, and it felt like a privilege to walk round and to feel like the people who were running it had such an enthusiasm for vehicles, and also the passenger project. It felt weirdly relatable in that if I had the vast amounts of money that it would take to do that, that's exactly what you would do, like to create such a beautiful, large-scale representation and cathedral to all things motoring, to have such beautiful displays of art alongside the vehicles and the historic memorabilia and trophies and everything was just, it was so beautifully done, and such a wonderful display of the love for motoring that you can very easily have if you're a car person. I believe, having been around there, that there is a second museum owned in the kind of southwest of the Netherlands that has more modern motoring history and stuff in it, that's owned by the Louwmans. So if I was to go back to the Netherlands, I would love to go back to the Louwman, but I would also probably go and try and get a visit to that other museum as well, because if this one was anything to go by, I'm sure it would be fantastic to go around. So I hope it's come across just how much I love it. We spent a lot of money on their very beautiful guidebook. I think it was like €30, but it's worth it, and it's such a beautiful thing to look through, and really reminds me of what a brilliant place it was to visit. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have that, and I hope you've enjoyed hearing about the museum, and you're perhaps tempted to go along yourself one day. In the meantime, thank you ever so much for listening, and drive safely and happy motoring.